Boys and girls, I've got a fantastic VOD for you here today, which is Chovy's Vex up against Neeko in the mid lane. And the reason I think this VOD is so good is because it shows a bunch of the kind of solid fundamentals to the laning phase and how they can be executed at a high level, while also showing kind of the importance of just a simple game plan and how far that can take you. There's also some other kind of cool advanced stuff that I will show you guys as well. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff, and I seriously think it'll be one of the best videos you've ever watched on the laning phase in League of Legends. So what I'll do is I'll timestamp everything in the description below, so if you want to skip to a specific part where I'm talking about something, feel free. There should be a lot of information in this video for you guys. So first things that I want to say, something I mentioned in my last video is that a lot of mids in Korea, when they've been playing immobile champs, have been taking phase rush. And the reason that's more and more common lately is because when you're playing in a mobile mage up against these really heavy gank setup mid jungles as well as supports, it can be quite hard to play as an immobile mid without flash. So, you know, imagine you're the Vex here and you're up against the Poppy, the Neeko, the Viego. This is CC and kind of gank potential from every role. And so just having the phase rush means that it's a lot easier to skirmish, and in a way you can kind of play more aggressively because you have a bit more safety. You know what I mean? It's kind of how, like, you know, if you lose your flash, for example, you have to play a bit safer for 5 minutes. But we don't really want that in League of Legends, right? We kind of want to be able to play aggressive as often as possible, you know, to just keep up the pressure, you know, keep I guess build up a lead whenever you're able to, just because that's kind of how soloq works, right? That's the first thing, is the interesting thing about the phase rush and kind of the trend. Now, the second thing I want to show you guys is, actually, I want to show you guys the runes. So let me just go over here and move my cam. So something else that's been very common in Hyder lately is people taking a lot of early game runes. So you see a lot of absolute focus, you see scorch, you see attack speed, DMAT here, and we change over to Neeko. Again, you know, laning keystone, sorry, with the airy, absolute scorch, got biscuits and everything for lane. Now, some of these are less useful than others, right? Like, in my opinion, biscuits are not a particularly good rune, but the reason I think you see more and more people taking these early game runes is because a very, very simple way, a very simple game plan for kind of playing out the early game is simply to, like, use your skill or use your runes or use your matchups or whatever to kind of build a lead over your opponent early, and then base with a gold advantage. And then once you have that gold advantage, you know, you have more stats than your opponent, you just keep trading with them, right? And so if you take full scaling runes and your opponent takes full early game runes, sure, you might outscale, but the problem is that you're just giving them this really easy to access kind of game plan where they can just bully you out early. They can then look to, you know, recall, have like maybe a dark seal when you only have, like, I don't know, a Doran's ring or something, and then they kind of just like win trades from there. So I actually want to go back and we'll kind of look through this, but basically the important things I've said so far is that I think that at the moment in League of Legends, having a good early game setup with your keystone and runes and stuff like that is pretty important. And while there is an argument that scaling is better if your opponents don't punish you, in fact, I don't even think that's an argument, I think that's just a fact. I think that as you get higher level and your opponents do punish you, and if you know how to punish people with a good rune setup, it's going to go a really long way. And we'll kind of see that here. So remember, step one is just to kind of build that lead over our opponent, to kind of make sure that we base with more gold than our opponent, we base with more XP than our opponent, and the easiest way to do that is just to force them to base a wave earlier, right? Like, if you shove them under a tower and you force them to base a wave earlier than you do, naturally, they base with 6 less creeps of gold and XP, you get to spend all that gold and they don't, and then you can kind of begin the snowball from there. So Vex specifically, I mean, in the early game, again, we've got all these early game runes with the Absolute and the Scorch and stuff, but Vex is quite hard to trade back against. So is Neeko, to be honest. Both these champs are quite strong in lane, and I think the Corrupting Pot does make a fairly big difference here as well, to adding a lot of sustain. Something you always want to try and do on Vex here, and Chovy tried to do it, is just, if you hit someone with the E fear, you generally just want to immediately follow up with the Q, because that's the easiest way to just guarantee the damage, and it's quite hard to hit Q without Eing first. But you know, if you E first, then it's not too bad. So we can see here, trades are going quite well. And maybe a little thing you might have missed here is that normally, right, what happens is, like, when you trade on your opponent, right, the kind of, you've just invested all your cooldowns. So it's very natural for your opponent to look to trade back immediately after. Sometimes in low elo, people get scared because they're like, oh, the Neeko would be like, I just took so much damage, I need to back away. But in reality, it's the other way around. Like, this is your best opportunity to trade because Vex just used all their cooldowns, and Neeko's are just coming up, right? So you can see that Chovy's expecting this Q to come out because it's like, what else is Neeko going to do? She has to take advantage of this window where the Vex doesn't have cooldowns. So that's a Q that, like, it might look like mechanics when it's being dodged, but I actually think it's more of a prediction. But anyway, let's continue on. So here, level 3 advantage, and you are going to get level 3 first if you're the one pushing the wave. So you can see that with control of the wave here, Chovy hit level 3 first. He used that to get a slightly better trade. And this is kind of what I mean, where, remember, before we have that XP or gold lead, the things that we use to build our lead are more, they're a bit more, not intangible, but it's like we can't use things like just having more stats than our opponents. Like we have to use like the minions to give us level advantages, or we have to like dodge their abilities and punish their cooldowns. You know, this is kind of the hardest stage of mid lane, where it's like we're just using, all we have over opponent is a skill difference or a matchup difference. There's nothing concrete, nothing like items or XP or whatever that just says that we win trades. But this is really, really good. So Chovy, he crashes this wave, drops a ward to protect himself from anything more, and then Neeko is low enough HP that she's forced to base. So this is exactly what you want, right? So if we kind of see what happens here, is that Neeko based having 19 CS, whereas Vex is basing with 29 CS, and also if Neeko didn't TP, she would lose this XP, right? So she manages to get the XP, but she is down quite a lot of gold when it comes to just spending it. So we see Chovy base, you know, he buys another item for early game. So I don't always agree with this, but either way, let's just look at the combat stats, right? So we've got Doran's Dark Seal refillable. Those are the big ones. Whereas here we've got Corrupting Pot, which is better than refillable. We've got Match Doran's Rings. And then it really comes down to, you know, how do we feel, I guess, about the boost Dark Seal. So can kind of depend, right? Like currently, I believe Neeko will have, yeah, Neeko has more AP, but the movement speed is here for Vex. And I think that in a matchup that's very skill shot heavy, a lot of the time movement speed is better than raw stats. Like that's something you have to remember, is that sure, you could just buy more AP, but it's a difference, right? If you can just dodge the skill shot completely, that negates the damage totally. So having spent more gold here, you would expect Chovy to be stronger, especially with the extra Corrupting Pot sustain. And this should mean that trades start to go kind of in your favor. Now, another thing that I haven't really talked about yet is how you can kind of play the attrition game sometimes. So here, right, like we have one thing, especially with minion demat, is that you're going to be able to clear waves much more efficiently than your opponent. So you can see, rather than using, actually you can't see it, like, give me 1 second. You can see right here, rather than using what you normally see, right, is you see 3 on the caster creeps, or like 3 on the melees or something, just to kind of allow the difference between clearing that or not. But what Chovy is instead going for here is he's going for just making it so he can clear a wave more efficiently than your opponent. And the reason that's actually pretty impactful versus a champion like Neeko is because Neeko's Q costs more than Vex. So like if you imagine just Vex queuing the wave, right? It costs Vex 55 mana currently, whereas it costs Neeko 70 mana. So it's much more expensive. And also, if you just imagine, like, we're having wave clear wars on mid, right? If Vex queues the wave, it probably costs Neeko more than just 1 Q to match that. She probably needs to EQ the wave or something. So that means that with the minion demat and just like by attacking the wave, Vex can actually come out on top just by hitting the wave, which is something that we're going to see as the lane goes on. And I think the reason that I want to bring that up is because a lot of people will kind of look at Chovy's laning phase and be like, wow, like this guy always has priority and like he's always farmed really well. And that's true, like he does do these things, but he also has these kind of little tricks where, you know, he's not actually last hitting as much as you'd think. Like if you take a look at this wave, for example, right? How many creeps on this wave did he actually last hit out of 6? I think the answer is only 2. You know, the rest he just killed with a spell. I guess he still lasted them, but you see what I mean, right? It's like, for the most part, just by preparing this wave well, he was able to get all the CS. And I think that's something that Chovy does better than perhaps any other mid laner, is prepping the CS to make it really easy, whereas his opponents oftentimes are kind of just left autoing them like to last it, as opposed to using the spells. So we'll continue on. Trades have been going fairly well. Again, just looking for those E trades every time we have the fear up. If we can get a Q afterwards, that's great. And you can see as well, this is a pretty big mistake by Neeko. So whenever you're playing in the wave, that allows Vex the opportunity to hit both the wave and you. And even here, like having moved away, it's still, you can see the wave is gone after just 2 Qs, which is very cheap for Vex, and it costs Neeko a lot to match that. And it's also quite difficult because Neeko has to choose, you know, do I harass this Vex or do I hit the wave? And you can kind of see Neeko is stuck, you know, last hitting all this time. Meanwhile, like the Vex has a bunch of priority and can do whatever she wants and can threaten the map. And you saw before, right? Like she used the priority to drop this pink here and the ward here. And this is actually a perfect setup. Like if you're ever looking to get just like perfect control, pink in this bush and ward over here on the raptor pit, this is ideal because this just gives you so much control over one side of the map. And it's almost always better to control one side of the map as opposed to splitting your control. Like you wouldn't want to, you don't often like pink here and ward top side because that kind of splits it too much. You want like very solid control over one side of the map and use your pink wards to allow you to push your yellow wards deeper in. But okay, let's return back to the lane. So again, we're looking to push, and you can kind of see that we're starting to build up this lead even more, right? Like the CS lead is slowly growing, partly because it's difficult for Neeko to farm these waves, right? You can kind of see that she is missing some here and there because she's forced to order them. She doesn't have the same mana efficiency that Vex has, and she's just kind of stuck under tower. Meanwhile, we can see Vex is just walking around, right? All the time in the world, and the mana isn't really a huge issue either because, again, one, Vex mana efficiency is really good, but also just because there's stuff like the honey fruit in the river. So this is kind of how you can, I guess, win your lane without... It's not without trading so much, it's more like without needing to be that much better than your opponent, kind of when it comes to micro, right? Like, these are all just decisions. He's made the decision with his runes. He, you know, I guess in the very early game, it might have been more to do with, like, the mechanics, like dodging skill shots and stuff like that. But since then, it's really just been recognizing that there is like that mana difference and that you can win this lane just by spam pushing. And it's also done really well to make sure he has really good CS. And something you always want to do when you have the winning lane is force your opponent to base first. And that's something that is once again happened here, right? We forced Neeko to base first initially. That caused her to... She didn't miss any XP, but she didn't get to farm that wave before basing, right? So she based with less gold. Same things happens here. Neeko does get back in time to get this XP, but remember that she doesn't get to spend the gold from this wave until next base, whereas Vex gets to spend it right now. So you would expect Vex to come back and be stronger. And you can see does come back now and is feeling very good. They've both gone for tier 2 boots. Again, this is very, very common in skill shot heavy matchups and also just common in champs that kind of need to skirmish, right? So boots, obviously, they're allowing you to dodge all your opponent's skill shots, but also it makes roaming easier, it makes fighting in river easier, and both of these champs are champs that sort of really want to skirmish. You can see here as well that Chovy is doing his best probably to avoid laning against Neeko straight up, because Neeko is very, very strong in lane, but by attacking the wave, it's becoming incredibly difficult for Neeko to just look to trade on Vex on cooldown, because so many of these cooldowns are just being forced onto the wave. I want to take a look at this again because I think it's another really good example of just how you can prep the wave to make CSing easier for yourself. Something I always see in coaching sessions is people making CSing really hard for themselves when it doesn't really need to be. Like a lot of the time in mid lane, you only need to actually be good at last hitting with autos for about the first 5 or 6 minutes, because after that, if you prep the wave well, there's just ways to set it up to CS it really easy, right? Like you might auto the creeps low and then kind of like nuke them all down with a Q or something like that. And I think this is a good example, right? So one Q puts the backline very low. All you need to do here is last hit any kind of creep before you have your Q ready. And other than that, you can make it so you get maybe 5 out of 6 of this creep wave purely with abilities, right? And like, while obviously not every time and not every champ can do this, if you can do this, it just makes it so easy, because CSing, it never becomes like a challenge. It's just, you know, you line up the creeps, you prep them properly, and you're just going to get all of them. And I think that's Chovy's biggest secret, really, to having really, really high CS, is that he's always forcing his opponent to base first. Again, through like some skills, some clever lane mechanics, some, you know, game knowledge, stuff like that. But also, he's always basing with more gold than his opponent because he always has more CS. And then he uses that more CS to turn into more items. And then he uses that more items to continue to get priority, to continue to force the opponent to base first. So you can see how it kind of builds upon itself, right? He just kind of repeats the same thing over and over again. And suddenly, out of nowhere, he's actually up quite a bit of gold. Now, Neeko did just get a kill, which is a bit unfortunate. But you can actually see here that Chovy is still ahead of gold. And that's actually just because his CS is so high here. And I think sometimes Chovy CSing can be a bit of a meme. Like, I know a lot of people will actually criticize him for having like too high CS when his team is not doing anything. And I think in some senses, this criticism is justified. Like, there are definitely times when Chovy is farming when he probably should be doing something else, right? But I don't think this game is an example of that. And I think this is a really good example of just very consistent play, very easy to replicate laning techniques being like executed on a level that's allowing him to just kind of win a lane for free in what is, you know, very high low Korean challenger. I mean, Chovy, I think is currently, he's like rank 1 or rank 2 or something. So nothing to scoff at by any means. Once again, here is basing after Neeko, so he's going to have more gold, can go home, can pick up the lost chapter, and then just will be back. And from here on out, I think you can just kind of look to skirmish and stuff, do what Vex does best. You know, skirmishes obviously are going to be really, really good. And I think I said this in my previous video, but having a good early game, oh my god, okay, that was actually a sick play. Having a good early game in soloq is so important. Like, if you can consistently come out of the early game, like reasonably fed, no deaths, like good CS, a couple KP or whatever, you're in a really good spot, right? Like I look at this game and I think, okay, the chances of Vex winning this game are very, very high if you can come out of the early game like this. And especially now, right? Like what's the gold difference between mid laners? It's pretty significant, right? It's about 700. It's about to be even more. So getting close to 1k gold lead here. And again, I really like this VOD because it's a lot of like small things that are adding up. So I guess to kind of recap some of it, a lot of this is like the early game setup and the wave efficiency allows you a couple different win conditions. One, the early game setup, as well as just like, you know, playing trades better than your opponent, allows you to base with more gold. And then if you base with more gold, you can buy more items. And then you can look to rinse repeat, right? Just try and make your opponent base first. And just gradually, you'll have more CS than them. I think also very important is just the way you prep creeps, especially if you're in, honestly, like elos below master, people are going to be missing a lot of CS for free. So if you're just CSing well by setting up waves for yourself, you're naturally going to pull very, very far ahead of your opponent. And that's going to go like a really long way to consistently winning games. And that's what soloq is about, right? It is just a marathon. And so like if you have, you know, more consistency in your gameplay, you're probably going to find that while there will be some games that you still don't win because, you know, some games are really hard to carry, but you're going to just win. Your win rate overall is going to go up, and that's going to feel really good. So from the rest of this VOD, I actually don't think there is too much. You can kind of just see that with the lead that he has, he's just going to keep pushing mid, continue to pressure. Now they got the tower, so it's looking really good. They can continue to just one-shot these waves. And once you get mid tower, obviously, like the map opens up a lot. Like it's really easy for you to roam to other lanes, which, I mean, hey, you'll never say no to that. I guess one thing I'll quickly talk about here is sometimes people find themselves in this position where they're like, they've done really well in their lane, or at least they think they've done well in their lane. Like they've killed their opponent and stuff like that. And then they feel like they have trouble closing out the game. So let me talk about that for a minute, because, you know, you see this position and it's like, okay, how do I close out the game? How do I extend my lead? So sometimes you don't actually need to extend your lead as much as you need to preserve it. So like, for example, if you got really fed here and then we give over your bounty, you give over a bunch of deaths, you stop CSing. In fact, even if you didn't die, if you just stop CSing efficiently because you're like running around the map randomly, like that would be slowly losing your lead, right? So rather than extending your lead, just preserving it is a good start. Now, if you do want to extend your lead, generally like using your priority and running to another lane is like a good way to do it. But it's very, very, I'd say the main thing is that, you know, again, it's very important you come out of the early game as strong as you can, and then that you're just at every dragon fight, right? You just, every dragon fight, you try and have a lot of impact on it. You just try and win these skirmishes for your team. That's ultimately what's going to get you over the finish line, because most games in solo queue do just come down to some sort of random 5v5. And so the more fed you are for that, the better. Now, the VOD unfortunately does end here. The game does go for about 2 or 3 more minutes, but, you know, for some reason, the OPGG VOD doesn't work. So again, to quickly recap, I think the very important things in this video were the prepping of the creeps is really important. I think having that game plan of like, just force your opponent to base first, base with more gold, use that gold to continue to win trades, just rinse repeat is really, really good. And I also think there is something to be said for how important having a better early game setup than your opponent is, right? Like if you have in this game absolute focus, scorch, DMAT, and your opponent's running something like, let's say they're running like First Strike, Transcendence, Gathering Storm, and Magic Boots, like that's a lot of power missing. And while one of those things, like if they only had one, might not be the difference maker, when you have all those things compounded on top of each other, it can make a big difference. So do be careful when you're taking full scaling runes. You have to know it's in a lane that either the priority, people getting priority into might not matter, or you can get priority in spite of your scaling runes. I think that's very important. And of course, if you do take stronger early game setup than your opponent, look to leverage it over them, because if you have that strong early game setup and you're not forcing your opponent to base first, you're not basing with more gold than them, then it's kind of pointless, right? In a way, it's much easier to execute the scaling build because you can kind of just take it and forget about it. But I would say it's much more rewarding and you have much more agency if you can get good at playing the early game style. So that's going to be it for this video. Again, if you missed something, go back through the timestamps. I'm sure there'll be a lot of information there. If you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.